Our out-of-the-box change initiative is a management process we call TransitStat. Let me give you a little context about what we do. I work for the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority. You might hear me refer to this as RTA. We have about 2,400 employees and serve about 200,000 customers every day on our buses, light rail, and heavy rail networks throughout Northeast Ohio. Like everyone else, economic realities dictated our need to do more with less. But at the same time, instead of simply cutting, we have a strong commitment to quality. So we wanted to certainly preserve and, if we could, enhance the quality of our services. The first thing we had to change, however, was management culture. Our staff was much better at reporting on our performance than changing it. They felt all too willing to accept the status quo and truly felt powerless to enact meaningful change. We knew we had to change things and give them more power and show some improvements. And we heard of a data-driven management process that had great results in some applications around the country, and we set off to find more. The first time this process was used, to our knowledge, was the New York City Police Department, where it was called CompStat. I think it stood for Comprehensive Statistical Analysis. You may be familiar with this. It was kind of featured in the TV series later on called The Commission. I think it was Craig T. Nelson, who sat there in this war room with his assistant, and they plotted on this big electronic screen where the crimes were and when the crimes were and the nature of those crimes. And, you know, they really could do this stuff by type, time, and location. And with this process, they could deploy their police forces where they needed to be and in the right manpower configuration. The key to this was current and reliable information and the ability to respond to it. Pretty simple stuff. This process was then modeled in the city of Baltimore, where they called it CityStat. And that's really where we heard of it. Having little to lose, myself and several staff members piled into a van and drove to Baltimore, about a 6-hour drive, to kind of observe the process they were going through. And it really was an enlightening experience. When we got there, one of the CityStat topics for the day was streetlights. They had some complaints previously about streetlights being out, like probably most major cities do. And they came up with a plan to have a zero amount of streetlights out. That was their goal. And that's where really this data-driven process continued. You know, we saw a panel of what I'll call almost judges or elders, and they were being reported to by some middle management staff people as to what initiatives they took place and what the results of those initiatives were. And the research showed something like, you know, how many hours a light bulb should last. And they identified how many hours a light bulb would be on. As we all know, you know, it varies based on, you know, the time of the year, when you have a longer evening versus a shorter evening. They identified ways to change bulbs effectively. You know, the key wasn't to go out and change the light bulbs when one burned out, because you couldn't maintain a 0% goal if that happened, because one would have to go out before you needed to. The goal was to replace the bulbs before they got out. You know, really, really simple stuff, but something nobody else was doing. And that's just one example of one of the many things they looked at with their CityStat. How do we provide excellent services to our customers? How do we set up for it? What do we measure? What information do we need? And how do we act upon that information? On the 6-hour drive back to Ohio, my staff brainstormed ways to introduce the CityStat process to our industry, which is public transit, and we naturally called it TransitStat. We put together this TransitStat panel of 6 executives, kind of the judge and jury, or the elders, I referred to them. We selected several topics that we were struggling with, say, how can we use this process to show improvements in this structure? For each of these projects, or each of these individual areas of concentration, we put together a team of 4 or 5 individuals that had responsibility for those areas that could work on the problems, help us analyze the problems, and hopefully help us solve the problems. A lot of this is, we may be familiar with it as managers, as a root cause analysis of taking an issue and breaking it down into smaller pieces so you really understand the root cause of the problem. That enabled us to gather information, develop a plan for improvements, set some goals for improvements, and allocate resources where we needed to solve the problem. A lot of the TransitStat process is, measuring information, reporting information, brainstorming solutions, adjusting to the current situation, and then documenting the process, what we're doing, so we can have continued results. Under this process, the implementation team, is under pressure to show results, as they must sit before myself and the executive team, this TransitStat panel, and report every 2 weeks on what they found, what they've done, give us suggestions or solicit our suggestions as to what else they can do to really, show the improvements that we all know we need. They really are in the hot seat because they're not only there today, but know they'll be back in 2 weeks to let us know more about what's happening. The keys to success have been continual monitoring of the situation, managing with documented facts, not with suppositions, which we see all too often in an organization, holding them responsible for the improvements, giving them the resources they need, and certainly celebrating victories. This process has helped us, this change initiative has helped us to do things a much better way, doing things that are based on realities of life, not just organizational history. It's also important that when we come up with a plan, that the implementation of that plan is supported by everyone within the organization. That has cut a lot of the finger pointing out of the equation. I can't tell you how important this has been to us. Over the last 5 years, we've saved in excess of $28 million in really bottom line cash. In addition, we've seen improvements in the quality of our product. Very, very important for our organization. It really fulfilled our mission. Some of the initiatives we looked at, overtime was the first initiative. How can we drive down overtime? What are the components of overtime? And we found out that overtime was very easy to control if you looked at the components of it. Utility cost, towing cost. By towing, I mean, how much do we spend every year towing broken down buses? The productivity of our telephone information department was improved. Very different than towing, but again, another way we're able to implement this change initiative for the benefit of the organization. The great news is that the solution to the problem, the solution to every problem we looked at was right in front of us. This was not rocket science. These really were no-brainers, but we had to break it down to find out the best way to solve the problem. Let me give you a couple examples. One, I mentioned the towing costs. Historically, we spent about $400,000 a year towing broken down buses. And I would go to my staff every year as I was allocating and approving contracts saying, why do we spend so much money towing buses? And the answer was, because we've always spent that much money towing buses. It was a cost per tow. We knew approximately how many tows every year we had. So we never looked at what comprised the tows and how do we reduce the number of the tows. We're looking at reducing the cost per each tow, but not the amount of the tows. So through this TransitStat process, we were able to break that down. We found out the greatest percentage of tows we were ordering were because buses were out of diesel fuel. And it was pretty obvious. A very simple solution to that was for our maintenance vehicles, which we have on the road to service buses as they're in service, we're not carrying diesel fuel to put in buses that ran out of fuel. Sounds like a very simple thing, but we simply weren't doing it, and no one looked at it down to that level, at my level, to figure out what the problem was. The solution was, as I mentioned, carry diesel fuel on the maintenance vehicles, and we cut our towing costs by $200,000. Very simple process. Another very simple example I'll give you is we had an issue with buses not starting, and so they couldn't begin their day to go out and service our customers. Through a data-driven process, through drilling down on why buses weren't started, we found out that the majority of those cases were battery failure. We also found out that the typical battery that we bought and we're installing on our buses, actually there's 8 batteries in a bus, we're lasting 20 months. Looking back at the Baltimore streetlight example, we are now through this process replacing our batteries every 18 months before the average 20-month period arrives when buses would no longer start. So we're fixing them before they break. very simple, helped us with reliability, helped us with cost, and certainly provided much better service to our customers. And let me give you just a third example because it's somewhat different. We have a telephone information department where people call, and we handle upwards of 10,000 phone calls a day about when's my next bus coming, that type of call. And again, I was under a lot of pressure by the department that runs that to hire more people because we had a lot of people on hold. A lot of people would hang up. We'd have some missed calls. It would be very easy for me to allocate a couple $100,000 for 3 more telephone operators if I had a couple $100,000. But this was a point in time where we really didn't. So we said, well, let's look at how to break down the phone call. How can we get our telephone information people to be more productive? So again, through a data-driven process, we looked at the average length of time for every phone call, the average length of time on hold. We looked at every single telephone operator as to how productive were they being. What was the average length of their call? How many calls were they answering in the average hour? How many calls were they answering in the average day? Was their productivity higher at the beginning of the day versus just before lunch or at the end of the day? And through this, we found out that the one thing we thought we could resolve was to reduce the amount of time we were on the phone call with every single caller. We were on the call. The average call we were on the average call about 2 minutes and 4 seconds. And through training, through incentives, through initiatives, through the fact that we were monitoring their situation, we reduced that number by 50%. And right out of the box, we're handling twice as many calls with the same number of staff people. Again, we were able to break it down, get the statistical data, have the team investigate different ways, look at different training scenarios, look at different ways we can provide some incentives and recognition to the people, and through that, they gave us some great results. Most of which, this is all rocket science, and one important thing going in, let me tell the listeners, is you cannot be embarrassed by what you find, because it's very easy to think that we should have thought of these things years ago, and it's almost embarrassing to say that after many, many years of paying $400,000 a year for towing, we can cut that in half by simply carrying diesel fuel on the maintenance trucks. You really can't think of it that way. This management process, this change initiative, it helped us, be a more data-driven organization to make decisions that are really good decisions based on the facts. It's identified cross-functional gaps. It's identified some negative trends very early. And it's stopped the finger pointing because the decisions are being made are our decisions, not one individual's decisions within the organization. It's helped us to be more effective managers. We are telling our people what's expected of them. We're letting them be part of the solution. And we're giving them the tools they need to effectuate the change. And that biggest tool we found is better information. And the result of that knowledge that better information is so important, we've actually hired more data analysts in each major department here to collect the data, to analyze the data, and to be part of the solution. So it's really been great for us. We've shared our success with many. They've had light success. And I really hope the listeners here try a more data-driven approach, and we think you'll have success as well.